The high-pitched scream of an angle grinder was the only thing louder than the pounding of my heart as I sprinted barefoot across the gravel. In the strobe-like flash of orange sparks, I didn't see a prestigious HOA president. I saw a woman possessed. Jessica was perched precariously on my own stepladder, her silk pajamas splattered with gray metal dust, frantically sawing into the neck of a 10-foot steel gnome. Behind her, a 5-gallon bucket of architectural beige primer sat ready like a weapon of war, poised to erase every bit of soul I had welded into the gateway of her sterile kingdom. "It's a glitch!" she shrieked over the mechanical roar, her eyes wide and glassy in the beam of my flashlight. "You're just a smudge on the glass, Willow. I'm fixing the error." As the grinder bit deeper into the reinforced steel, I realized this wasn't about property values or neighborhood aesthetics anymore. The prestige of Pinecrest Estates had finally snapped, and as the blue and red lights of a patrol car crested the hill, I knew the morning commute was about to witness the most expensive mental breakdown in the history of suburban zoning. Today's story is from Willow, a 30-something metal artist who measures her life in arc welder sparks and the weight of inherited rust rather than property appraisals and curb appeal. Having moved back into her grandmother's shaggy, wildflower-choked sanctuary at the literal gates of a sterile, gated community, she creates towering sculptures from scrap because she believes a home should be a soul project, not just a high-yield investment. She isn't looking for a fight, but she's discovered that in a neighborhood obsessed with architectural beige, simply existing as an individual is the most provocative art form of all. Before we dive in, please do me a favor and smash that like button now and comment below on what you would have done if you were in Willow's situation. Would you have built a 10-foot steel spite gnome called Norman? The first thing you need to know about Grand's house is that it doesn't just sit on the land, it stubborns its way into it. It's a 1920s craftsman, a riot of peeling cedar shingles, wraparound porches, and a yard that hasn't heard the judgmental whine of a lawnmower since the Clinton administration. To me, it's a sanctuary of peeling paint and climbing jasmine. To the people living behind the wrought iron gates across the street, it's a non-conforming structure, a glitch in the spreadsheet of their lives. I was out front, hauling a rusted section of a 1950s tractor axle toward my welding shed, when the silver Range Rover hissed to a stop. The gates of Pinecrest Estates, two massive, sandblasted slabs of pretension, swung open just long enough for the SUV to crawl through and pull onto the shoulder of my gravel driveway. Out stepped Jessica. She was 50-something, dressed in a crisp, white linen tunic that likely cost more than my entire professional toolkit. She carried a leather-bound clipboard like a medieval shield. She didn't walk across the asphalt. She marched, her designer heels clicking a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that sounded like a countdown to an explosion. "Good morning," she said, though her tone suggested it was a legal deposition. "I'm Jessica, president of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association." I wiped a streak of grease across my forehead with the back of a gloved hand, probably just mapping out a new smudge. "Willow Bradman. I live here." "Yes, we're aware," she said, her eyes darting to my wildflower meadow, a deliberate chaos of California poppies and milkweed that served as a buffet for bees and a middle finger to her monoculture turf policy. "We were quite fond of your grandmother. She was quiet, private. But since her passing, the aesthetic of this—" She gestured vaguely at my porch, where a half-finished copper kinetic sculpture was spinning lazily in the breeze. "This entrance corridor has significantly detracted from the prestige our members expect when they return home." I leaned against the heavy iron axle, feeling the sun-warmed rust bite into my palms. "The entrance corridor? You mean the public road?" Jessica's smile was thin, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes and usually precedes a lawsuit. "While your property is technically unincorporated and outside our gates, it is the singular visual experience for every one of our homeowners. We've noticed your projects in that mailbox." She pointed a manicured finger at the mailbox Gran had painted a vibrant, celestial teal. It sat there, glowing like a sapphire in a desert of beige. "It's the wrong shade of blue, Willow," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were telling me I had a terminal illness. "It clashes with the Tuscan sand palette of our gatehouse. It's bringing down the property values for everyone behind those bars." "The blue stays, Jessica," I said, a familiar spark of rebellion igniting in my chest. "And so do the projects. I'm an artist. This isn't an investment for me. It's my space. I don't care about maximizing value for people who live behind a fence. Jessica's smile didn't falter, but her grip on the clipboard tightened until her knuckles turned the exact shade of her tunic. We prefer the term resident, Willow. And in this valley, we value cohesion. I'd hate for our legal committee to have to explore the city's nuisance ordinances regarding industrial debris and residential zones. It would be a shame to see such a legacy caught up in litigation. She turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV without waiting for a reply. As the Range Rover disappeared behind the closing iron gates, I looked at the rusted axle at my feet. I wasn't going to paint the mailbox. In fact, if Jessica wanted a singular visual experience, I was going to give her one that would haunt her dreams. I dragged the axle into the shed and grabbed a piece of chalk. I began sketching on the concrete floor. I started with the feet, massive, reinforced steel boots, then the round, belly-heavy torso made from an old water heater. But it was the head that mattered. It needed to be the international symbol of go away. I pulled down my welding mask. The blue-white spark of the arc welder illuminated the shed, casting a giant, grumpy shadow against the back wall. Norman was coming. I spent the better part of the night in a cocoon of blue light and ozone. There is a specific kind of meditative trance that comes with arc welding. The world shrinks down to the 6 inches in front of your mask, a universe of molten starlight and the smell of toasted iron. By 4 a.m., my back was screaming, but Norman was whole. I'd used the tractor axle for his spine, giving him a skeletal rigidity that could withstand a hurricane or a highly motivated HOA president. His body was a discarded 30-gallon water heater I'd found behind a local plumber's shop, and his arms were thick-gauge exhaust pipes, bent at the elbows to hold his pièce de résistance, a massive, rusted steel clipboard. I didn't sleep. I just drank 3 cups of black coffee and waited for the first gray smudge of dawn to hit the valley. Using a hydraulic jack and a furniture dolly, I wheeled him out to the very edge of my property. I positioned him precisely 6 inches back from the public shoulder, right where my gravel met the asphalt of the entrance corridor. I tilted his head, a heavy, inverted propane tank with a welded-on rebar beard, at a jaunty, judgmental angle. Norman didn't just look at the cars. He scrutinized them. The first victim was a black BMW at 6:15 a.m. It slowed to a crawl as the gates hissed open. I watched from my porch, hidden behind the overgrown jasmine, holding my mug like a holy relic. The driver, a guy in a sharp suit, actually rolled down his window, stared up at Norman's 10-foot-tall silhouette, and mouthed a word I'm pretty sure was, "What?" Then came the morning rush. It was like watching a slow-motion pileup of cognitive dissonance. A parade of Teslas and Range Rovers braked hard as they crested the hill. Norman stood there, his steel clipboard gleaming in the rising sun, seemingly taking notes on every single one of them. At 8:30 a.m., the silver Range Rover appeared. Jessica didn't just drive past. She stopped dead in the middle of the road. I could see her through the windshield, her knuckles wide on the steering wheel, her mouth forming a perfect silent O of pure, unadulterated fury. She sat there for a full minute, blocking her own residents, who started a tentative chorus of polite, suburban honks behind her. She didn't get out this time. She just stared at Norman's welded eyes, then slowly crept past him, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, as if she expected the gnome to start chasing her. By noon, my phone started vibrating. It was a restricted number. Willow. The voice was tight, vibrating with a frequency that could probably shatter fine china. It was Jessica. I am standing in my kitchen looking at a 10-foot-tall monstrosity. It is a safety hazard. It is a distraction. It is, frankly, an assault on the senses. "Good morning, Jessica," I said, leaning back in my wicker chair. I call him Norman. He's a study in structural permanence. Do you like the beard? It's recycled rebar from a demolished bridge. I don't care if it's made of solid gold, Willow. You have exactly 24 hours to remove that idol before the HOA's legal counsel files for an emergency injunction. This is a residential neighborhood, not a junkyard. Technically, Jessica, my lot is zoned for mixed-use artisanal. My lawyer, well, my cousin who watches a lot of Law and Order, says I'm well within my rights to display large-scale sculpture. And besides, Norman isn't debris. He's the new neighborhood watch. "This is not a joke," she hissed. "You are deliberately provoking a community of 300 homeowners. You are one person, Willow. We are an institution. Well, I said, watching a small yellow butterfly land on Norman's steel hat. I guess we'll see which one of us is more durable. I hung up. 10 minutes later, a white Mercedes pulled up to my driveway. A woman I recognized from the Stepford side of the gates hopped out. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She was carrying a box of high-end donuts. Is that yours? She whispered, pointing at Norman with a grin that looked like it had been bottled up for a decade. He's my new roommate, I said. She handed me the donuts. Jessica sent out a community-wide email blast 5 minutes ago calling it a demonic lawn fixture. My husband and I haven't laughed that hard in years. Do you take commissions? I looked at the donuts, then at Norman, then back at the iron gates. The war hadn't just started. I'd just gained my first spy behind enemy lines. The bureaucracy didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with the slow, ominous crunch of a beige Ford Taurus pulling onto my gravel shoulder. It was 10 a.m., and I was in the front garden, thinning out the milkweed to make room for a new batch of sun-starved poppies. I heard the car door thud, a heavy government issue sound, and looked up to see a man in a short-sleeved button-down and a utility belt that looked like it weighed more than he did. He had a squint that suggested he'd spent his entire career measuring things that didn't want to be measured. "Miss Bradman?" he asked, his eyes already drifting upward, snagging on Norman's rusted rebar beard. "I'm with municipal enforcement, code compliance." I stood up, wiping damp earth onto my thighs and leaving a dark streak across my vintage work pants. "Help you with something, officer?" "We received a formal complaint," he said, pulling out a digital rangefinder and a tablet encased in a ruggedized rubber shell. "Multiple complaints, actually, regarding an unpermitted permanent structure, hazardous industrial debris in a residential adjacent zone, and potential violations of the Nuisance and Aesthetic Harmony Ordinance." I leaned on my trowel, looking past him toward the gates of Pinecrest Estates. I couldn't see Jessica, but I knew she was there, perched behind the tinted glass of her second-story sunroom, probably peering through a pair of Swarovski bird-watching binoculars. She wasn't just throwing stones anymore. She was trying to call in an airstrike. "It's not a structure," I said, keeping my voice level. "It's a sculpture. He's not bolted to a foundation. His center of gravity is lower than a bowling ball's, and he's made entirely of recycled medium. That's art, not an outhouse." The inspector sighed, a long, weary sound that told me he'd rather be anywhere else. "The report claims he's a navigational hazard for drivers entering the gated community. Something about distracting glare and psychological intimidation of motorists." I barked a laugh. Psychological intimidation? He's a gnome, not a gargoyle. Though, now that you mention it, a gargoyle would be a nice touch for the mailbox. He didn't laugh. He spent the next 45 minutes performing what looked like a forensic audit of my front yard. He measured Norman's height, exactly 9 feet, 11 inches. I'd triple-checked that during the 3 a.m. weld. 10 feet was the city's threshold for a monument permit. He checked the distance from the public road shoulder and gave the tractor axle boots a sturdy, professional kick. Norman didn't even vibrate. "Technically," the inspector muttered, scratching his neck as he scrolled through his tablet, "he's a lawn ornament. A big one, sure, but as long as he's behind the property line and isn't electrified or leaking fluids, I can't cite you for his existence." "And the industrial debris?" I asked, gesturing to the stack of copper pipes and the half-disassembled brass tuba leaning against the porch. "Zoning?" he said, sounding almost apologetic. "This lot is still listed as unincorporated mixed-use artisanal. Your grandmother was smart. She fought the rezoning back in the 80s. As long as you aren't running a commercial foundry with more than 3 employees, you're clear." He handed me a yellow slip, a notice of advisory. It wasn't a fine. It was a government-funded way of telling me to keep the noise down after midnight. As he drove away, the silver Range Rover finally emerged from the gates. Jessica didn't stop. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw set so tight, I thought I could hear her teeth grinding from across the road. She drove past Norman as if he were an unexploded bomb. But she wasn't the only one watching. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah, the donut neighbor from the Mercedes. "Jessica is absolutely vibrating. She's calling a special emergency session of the HOA board tonight at 7 p.m. Topic: boundary defense and perimeter integrity. She's telling everyone Norman is a satanic totem designed to attract vagrants and depress home values before the spring selling season. Half the street is planning to sit on their balconies tonight just to watch the glow from your shed. Give 'em a show, Willow." I looked at Norman. He looked back, his steel clipboard gleaming in the afternoon sun, ready for more notes. If Jessica wanted to talk about boundary defense, I was happy to provide the radar. I headed back to the shed. I had a crate of old brass instruments, a roll of copper mesh, and a very clear vision for a new piece. I was going to build the ear, a 6-foot tall, satellite dish-style ear, aimed directly at the Pinecrest Gatehouse. If they were going to spend their night talking about me, I might as well make sure they knew I was listening. The assembly of the ear took 3 days of obsessive surgical work. Unlike Norman's brutalist steel frame, this piece was delicate, a giant, 6-foot tall acoustic dish made from woven copper mesh and the flared bells of 3 salvaged brass tubas. I mounted it on a rotating swivel base, salvaged from a heavy-duty truck axle. When I rolled it out to the edge of the property right next to Norman, I didn't just place it anywhere. I used a laser level. I aimed the hollow, polished brass center of the dish directly at the Pinecrest Estates gatehouse, the glass-walled sentry box where the HOA hired security guards sat, and where Jessica often stood to monitor the flow of traffic. It didn't make a sound, but the visual was deafening. It looked like a piece of Cold War listening equipment reimagined by a steampunk madman. The reaction was instantaneous. As the morning commute began, drivers didn't just slow down. They stared. They pointed. A few of them even rolled down their windows to see if they could hear whatever I was supposedly intercepting. At 10 a.m., the silver Range Rover didn't drive past. It pulled directly into my driveway, tires crunching aggressively on the gravel. Jessica didn't wait for me to come to the door. She was out of the car before the engine had even stopped humming. She didn't look at Norman this time. She looked at the copper ear, her eyes tracking the trajectory of its focus straight back to her precious gatehouse. "This is a violation of privacy, Willow," she snapped, not even bothering with the greeting. She looked exhausted. Her perfect linen suit had a slight wrinkle at the shoulder, and her hair was pinned back with a severity that screamed migraine. "I have already consulted with our security firm. They believe this is a directional microphone. You are recording private conversations of our residents." I leaned against the porch railing, holding a cold glass of iced tea. "It's an acoustic sculpture, Jessica. It doesn't have a single wire, battery, or circuit board. It's passive. It just collects." "It collects what? Ambient frustration?" I suggested. "The sound of entitlement?" "Mostly, it just reflects the light beautifully at sunset. Have you noticed the patina? I used a vinegar and salt wash to get that specific shade of aged bureaucracy green." Jessica took a deep breath, her chest heaving. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. She didn't hand it to me. She set it on the porch steps as if it were contaminated. "I'm not here to debate aesthetics with you," she said, her voice dropping into a low, transactional hum. "The board has met. We recognize that this lifestyle is likely a result of financial necessity. You inherited a house you clearly cannot afford to maintain to a modern standard." I blinked. "I own it outright, Jessica. My taxes are paid. My bills are fine. For now," she countered. "But a house this old is a ticking time bomb. The roof, the plumbing, the structural integrity of that shed. The HOA has authorized me to make you a one-time private offer. We will purchase this property at 20% above market value. Cash. No inspections. You could move to a lovely loft in the city, somewhere with a vibrant arts district where people appreciate scrap metal." I looked at the envelope. It represented more money than I'd ever seen in my life. It represented a brand new studio, top-of-the-line equipment, and a life where I didn't have to worry about a Karen at my gates. Then I looked at the porch. I saw the notches Gran had carved into the doorframe to track my height as a kid. I smelled the jasmine she'd planted 40 years ago. I looked at Norman, who seemed to be waiting for my answer. "20% above market?" I asked. Jessica's eyes sparked with a predatory triumph. "Cash. We can close in 14 days. Imagine, Willow. No more letters. No more city inspectors. No more conflict." I walked down the steps, picked up the envelope, and handed it back to her. "You're right about one thing, Jessica. I can't afford to maintain this house to your standard because your standard is boring, and boring is expensive. It costs you your soul." Her face went pale. "You're refusing?" "I'm not just refusing. I'm inspired, I said, looking over her shoulder at the empty space next to the ear. I think the neighborhood needs a third piece. Something about reflection. Something that helps people see themselves as they really are. Jessica didn't scream. She didn't argue. She just tucked the envelope back into her bag, her hand shaking almost imperceptibly. You'll regret this, Willow, she whispered. I've tried to be the good neighbor. I've tried to help you out of this hole. But if you want to turn this into a war of attrition, remember, I have the resources of an entire community. You have a pile of junk and a dead woman's house. She got back into her Range Rover and reversed out so fast, she kicked up a cloud of dust that coated Norman in a fine layer of gray silt. I watched her go, then went inside to get my sketchbook. The mirror wall was no longer just an idea. It was a necessity. The rejection of the buyout offer didn't just bruise Jessica's ego. It seemed to puncture the very reality she'd built for herself. For the next 3 days, the silver Range Rover didn't stop. It sped past my driveway so fast, I could feel the displacement of air rattling the window panes of the sunroom. But while the president was in a state of high-velocity mourning, the rest of the neighborhood was waking up. It started with a knock at 9 p.m. I was in the shed, my goggles pushed up onto my forehead, trying to figure out how to mount a series of polished hubcaps onto a swaying willow tree frame. I opened the side door to find a man in a golf shirt and expensive loafers standing in the shadows of my gravel drive. He looked terrified, glancing back toward the glowing Pinecrest sign, as if an HOA sniper might be perched in the oak trees. Miss Bradman? He whispered. He held out a crumpled brown paper bag. I'm David, from 42 Oakmont. I'm the one Jessica fined $50 last month because my mulch was too dark a shade of chocolate. I leaned against the doorframe, a wrench still in my hand. Chocolate mulch? That's a new one. She's a tyrant, David said, his voice gaining a frantic edge. She spent the last 2 board meetings ranting about your monstrosities. But honestly, my kids love the gnome. They call him the boss. We all do. We're tired of the beige, Willow. We're tired of the rules. He reached into the bag and pulled out a bottle of very expensive scotch. I want to commission something. Something small. Something I can hide in my interior courtyard where her beautification committee can't see it from the street. Uh, Mini Norman? I looked at the scotch, then at David's desperate suburban eyes. I realized then that I wasn't just an eyesore to these people. I was a pressure valve. I can do a mini Norman, I said, a grin tugging at my lips. But he'll have to be holding a tiny, middle finger-shaped trowel for artistic integrity. David let out a laugh that sounded like it had been trapped in his lungs for a decade. Perfect. I'll pay double. Just don't tell anyone I was here. He wasn't the last one. Over the next week, the underground resistance became a steady stream of midnight visitors. I met a surgeon who wanted a scrap metal dog for his backyard, a lawyer who commissioned a miniature ear for her home office, and even the HOA's own treasurer, a woman named Linda, who showed up with a box of artisanal chocolates and a piece of very interesting information. She's using the legal fund, Linda whispered, as we sat on my back porch, away from the prying eyes of the gatehouse. Jessica has authorized 3 different consultation retainers this week. She's trying to find a way to sue you for intentional diminution of value. She's spending the neighborhood's dues to fund her personal grudge against you. Is that legal? I asked. Linda shrugged, popping a chocolate into her mouth. Technically, no. Not without a full board vote. But she's the president, and she's convinced everyone that your presence is an emergency that requires immediate executive action. She's obsessed, Willow. She spends hours in the gatehouse now, just staring at your yard. I looked out at Norman, standing tall in the moonlight. He looked peaceful, his steel clipboard catching the silver light. Across the street, the gatehouse was a beacon of sterile, fluorescent white. I could see a silhouette through the glass, a stiff, upright figure with a clipboard of her own. She thinks she can outspend me, I said quietly. She has $50,000 in the reserve fund, Linda warned. She'll bury you in paperwork until you can't afford to keep the lights on in your studio. I felt a cold chill, but it wasn't from the night air. It was the realization that I wasn't just fighting a neighbor, I was fighting an institution. But Linda didn't know one thing about Grant's house. The lights in the studio didn't run on money. They ran on spite. Let her spend it, I said, looking at the stack of mini Normans I'd started welding for the neighbors. If she wants to turn this into a war of attrition, she's going to find out that art is a lot cheaper to produce than lawsuits. The next morning, I didn't work on the ear or the hubcap tree. I went to the local salvage yard and bought 3 crates of industrial-grade mirrors. If Jessica wanted to spend the neighborhood's money to watch me, I was going to make sure she had a very clear view of herself. The summons didn't arrive via a polite knock. It was tucked into my screen door like a threat. A heavy, legal-sized envelope with the city's crest stamped in a cold, authoritative blue. Jessica had finally stopped trying to buy me and started trying to legislate me out of existence. Public hearing. Case hashtag 4492B. Alleged violation of Ordinance 12C. Public nuisance and visual safety. I spent the night before the hearing, not with a lawyer, but with a blowtorch. I wasn't going to show up in a suit. I wasn't going to pretend to be the reasonable neighbor she wanted me to be. I was Willow Bradman, the woman who lived in the house that time forgot, and I had a giant steel gnome for a best friend. When I walked into the City Hall community room, the air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like a meat locker. Jessica was already there, seated at the front of the gallery. She looked immaculate. A navy blue power suit, pearls, and a posture so rigid she looked like she'd been cast in bronze. Behind her sat the beautification committee, a phalanx of 6 women in varying shades of pastel, all clutching identical leather planners. But as I turned to find a seat, I saw the back half of the room. There was David from 42 Oakmont. There was Sarah with the donuts. There was Linda, the HOA treasurer, wearing a large sun hat and dark glasses like she was incognito at a spy convention. At least 20 residents from inside the gates were sitting in the back 3 rows, and none of them were wearing navy blue. The zoning board chairman, a man named Miller who looked like he'd rather be fishing, cleared his throat. Case 4492B, the Pinecrest Homeowners Association versus a yard. Jessica stood up. She didn't just speak. She performed. She walked to the podium and laid out a thick binder of evidence. Members of the board, she began, her voice a practiced tremolo of concern. We are here today to discuss a matter of public safety and communal standards. For months, the entrance to our prestigious community has been marred by what can only be described as industrial refuse masquerading as art. This gnome is nearly 10 feet tall. It is a distraction to motorists. It is a magnet for vagrants. And most importantly, it is a calculated assault on the property values we have worked decades to uphold. She clicked a remote, and a slideshow began on the wall. There was Norman, looking particularly grumpy in the rain. There was the ear, glinting ominously. There was even a photo of my mailbox. Property values in the Gateway corridor have already fluctuated by 3%, Jessica claimed, citing a graph that looked like it had been drawn in crayon by a very stressed accountant. We are requesting an immediate abatement of nuisance order. The resident must remove these structures within 48 hours or the city must intervene. Chairman Miller looked at the photos, then at me. Ms. Bradman, your response? I stood up. I didn't go to the podium. I just stayed by my seat, my hands tucked into the pockets of my paint-stained overalls. I'm an artist, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. The debris Jessica is talking about is recycled steel. The structures are sculptures. And the nuisance she's referring to is simply the fact that she can't control what I do on my own land. It's a safety hazard, one of the pastel ladies chirped from the front row. Is it? I asked, looking at Chairman Miller. I reached out to the local police precinct yesterday. I asked for the accident reports for the intersection outside the Pinecrest gates for the last 6 months. Do you know how many there were? I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket. 0. In fact, average speeds through the gate area have decreased by 5 miles per hour. Norman isn't a distraction. He's the most effective speed bump the city never had to pay for. A muffled snicker broke out in the back of the room. Jessica spun around, her eyes darting like a hawk, looking for a field mouse. Furthermore, I continued, this property has been zoned for mixed-use artisanal since 1984. My grandmother made sure of it. I am well within the height limits, the setback requirements, and the noise ordinances. What Jessica is asking for isn't code enforcement. It's an aesthetic dictatorship. And last I checked, this wasn't Pinecrest, it's the United States. The room erupted, not into a riot, but into applause. David stood up and whistled. Sarah started clapping. Even Linda gave a subtle, gloved thumbs up. Chairman Miller banged his gavel, but he was hiding a smile behind his hand. Order. Order in the chamber. He looked at Jessica, whose face was now a shade of red that matched the forbidden poppies in my garden. Ms. President, while the board appreciates your enthusiasm for neighborhood aesthetics, the city does not have the jurisdiction to enforce HOA rules on non-member private property. As long as the gnome remains behind the property line and doesn't fall on a car, he's a resident of this city just like you. Case dismissed, Miller grunted. And Miss Bradman? Nice welding. My grandson wants to know if the gnome has a name. Norman, I said. The beautification committee filed out in a cloud of perfume and fury. Jessica stayed for a moment, staring at me. She didn't look righteous anymore. She looked dangerous. The prestige was slipping through her fingers, and I knew exactly what happened to people who felt they had nothing left to lose. I walked out into the sunlight, feeling the weight of the victory. But as I saw the silver Range Rover peel out of the parking lot, I realized this wasn't the end. It was the pivot. I went straight to the hardware store. It was time for the mirrors. The morning after the hearing, the air at the entrance to Pinecrest Estates felt different. It was thicker, charged with the kind of static that precedes a summer storm. I didn't wait for Jessica to make her next move. I spent the sunrise bolting the reflection array to the street-facing side of my perimeter fence. I'd spent the previous night in the shed, cleaning 3 dozen industrial-grade mirrors I'd scavenged from an old dance studio renovation. I framed them in rusted steel channel, angling them with mathematical precision. My goal wasn't just to be bright, it was to be a mirror in the most literal sense. I wanted every resident of Pinecrest to have to look at themselves as they waited for the gates to open. By 3 p.m., the mirror wall was live. It was breathtaking. It turned my fence into a shimmering, fragmented kaleidoscope of the neighborhood. When the sun hit the western ridge, the mirrors caught the light and threw long, golden daggers across the asphalt. It didn't just illuminate the road, it turned the entrance corridor into a cathedral of glass. And then, the silver Range Rover appeared. Jessica didn't even make it to the gate. As she crested the hill, the low afternoon sun hit the mirrors at a perfect 45-degree angle. A brilliant, concentrated beam of light splashed across her windshield. She slammed on her brakes, her tires screeching against the pavement. Behind her, a line of cars began to back up, their drivers shielding their eyes. I was sitting on my porch, finishing a sketchbook entry, when I heard the sirens. Not the aggressive whoop-whoop of a chase, but the steady, rhythmic pulse of a local patrol car. Officer Miller, the same one who checked on Norman a few weeks back, stepped out of the cruiser. He was squinting so hard his eyes were practically shut. He walked over to the fence, his hand hovering near his brow like a permanent visor. "Willow," he said, his voice strained. "We've had 6 calls in the last 10 minutes. 3 of them claimed they were blinded by a celestial event. One lady said she thought she was being abducted by aliens." I stood up, walking down the steps. "It's an exploration of light and identity, officer. I call it the self-correction. It's a public safety hazard, Willow," he said, gesturing to the traffic jam forming at the gates. "I love the gnome. I even like the ear, but I can't have people driving into the ditch because your fence is throwing solar flares at them. This is a legitimate, dangerous distraction under the vehicle code." I looked at the mirrors. I could see Jessica standing by her car, her arms crossed, a look of smug, "I told you so" satisfaction on her face. She was practically vibrating with victory. "I understand," I said, my mind already racing. "Give me an hour. I'll make it safe." Officer Miller nodded. "An hour, Willow, or the city comes out with a crowbar and a dumpster. I'm trying to keep you on the right side of the law here." As he drove away, Jessica took a step toward my property line. She didn't cross it, but she leaned in close enough for me to see the triumph in her eyes. "You flew too close to the sun, didn't you, Willow? Even your art has limits." I didn't answer. I went into the shed and grabbed a vibrating palm sander and a box of heavy grit sandpaper. For the next 45 minutes, the neighborhood listened to the rhythmic whir-whir-whir of my sander. I went to every single mirror and ground the surface down. I didn't break them. I etched them. I turned the brilliant, reflective glass into a soft, milky brushed satin finish. When I was done, the dangerous glare was gone, but something much better had taken its place. The mirrors now glowed. They caught the light and held it. creating a soft, ethereal luminescence that didn't blind drivers but made the entire entrance look like it was shrouded in a permanent, ghostly fog. And because of the angle, that glow was now focused directly onto the front of Jessica's house. Her pristine white columns, her Tuscan sand trim, it was all bathed in a constant, inescapable, aged sea glass green light. It made her house look like it was underwater. It made it look moldy. I walked back to the porch and sat down. Jessica was still standing by her car, staring at her house. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending horror. She looked at her white front door, which now looked like a piece of rotted driftwood in the strange green light. I raised my glass of tea in a silent toast. "The light has shifted, Jessica," I whispered, "and I think you're finally starting to see the real picture." If what was a blitzkrieg of light, it was about to become a war in the trenches. Jessica had realized that the city wasn't going to do her dirty work for free, so she decided to use the one thing the Pinecrest HOA had in abundance: a bottomless pit of billable hours. It started on a Tuesday with a man in a cheap suit who looked like he'd been ironed flat. He didn't say a word. He just handed me a stack of papers so thick they were held together by a heavy-duty industrial binder clip. Civil Action Note 22 to 894, the Pinecrest Homeowners Association versus Willow Bradman. I sat on my porch, the smell of jasmine competing with the sterile scent of fresh toner, and started reading. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was an autopsy of my life. They were suing me for intentional interference with prospective economic advantage, private nuisance, and, my personal favorite, aesthetic malpractice. They'd hired a high-end architectural firm to write a 40-page report claiming that Norman's presence had created a psychological barrier to entry, effectively devaluing the 300 homes behind the gates by a collective $4 million. $4 million? I whispered to Norman. He just stared back, his steel clipboard indifferent to the math. By the end of the week, I was drowning. Process servers were appearing like ghosts in my driveway at dawn. I had discovery requests asking for every sketch I'd ever drawn, every receipt for every scrap of metal I'd bought since 2018, and a complete list of my grandmother's medical records. It was a legal colonoscopy. I called my cousin Marcus. He wasn't a high-priced litigator. He was a public defender who usually spent his days arguing about shoplifted electronics, but he knew the law. "Willow," he said, his voice crackling over the phone, "they're papering you. It's a classic bully tactic. They know they probably won't win on the merits, but they also know it costs you $500 just to have a lawyer read their nonsense. They're trying to bleed you dry before you ever see a courtroom." "How much?" I asked, looking at my bank balance. I had enough for 3 months of property taxes and a new tank of argon. To fight this properly? To file the counter motions and handle the depositions? You're looking at 20, maybe 30,000 in the first phase. In Willow, they're using the HOA's reserve fund. They aren't spending Jessica's money. They're spending the neighbor's money. I felt a cold, hollow pit open up in my stomach. The underground resistance had been great for donuts and scotch, but $20,000 was a different kind of support. That evening, I didn't weld. I sat in the dark of my studio, the only light coming from the soft, milky glow of the mirror wall reflecting the streetlights. I felt small. For the first time since I'd inherited the house, I looked at the for sale signs in the neighboring town and wondered if I was being selfish. Maybe Gran wouldn't want me to lose everything for a metal gnome. Then, a flicker of light caught my eye. A flashlight was bobbing down my driveway. I walked to the door and saw Linda, the HOA treasurer. She wasn't wearing her spyglasses this time. She looked tired, and she was carrying a heavy manila envelope. "I shouldn't be here," she said, stepping into the studio. "If Jessica finds out, she'll have me impeached by morning." "Then why are you here, Linda?" She handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of the HOA's internal ledgers from the last 60 days. She's bypassed the board for the last 3 payments to the law firm. She's categorized them as emergency gate maintenance. She's lying to us, Willow. She's so obsessed with prestige that she's committing fiduciary fraud to pay for your downfall. I looked at the numbers. Jessica had spent $12,000 of the neighbor's money in the last 3 weeks alone just to send me those binders. "Why tell me?" I asked. Linda looked around the studio, at the sketches, the half-finished ear, and the pile of mini Normans waiting for their owners. Because she's turning our home into a graveyard of rules, Willow. And because Norman is the only thing in this valley that looks like it's actually alive. I felt the spark come back. It wasn't a blue-white welding arc. It was a slow, steady burn. Jessica thought she could use her neighbor's wealth to crush me, but she'd forgotten one thing. Wealth is only power if the people you're taking it from don't find out. Thanks, Linda, I said. Don't thank me yet, she warned. She's planning something for the weekend. I heard her on the phone with a private contractor. She stopped talking about lawyers and started talking about clearance. I watched her vanish back into the shadows of the Pinecrest gates. I didn't go to bed. I went to the scrap pile. If Jessica was moving from the courtroom back to the corridor, I needed to make sure Norman wasn't alone. I grabbed my torch. It was time to build a witness. The air in the valley had turned sour. The heat of the day didn't dissipate at sunset anymore. It lingered, heavy and thick with the smell of scorched metal and the ozone from my welder. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since Linda's visit. Every time a car slowed down near my driveway, my hand instinctively reached for my heavy mag light. I was no longer just an artist. I was a sentry. I spent the week building the witness. It was a smaller, more mobile piece than Norman. A hunched, multi-eyed creature made from old brass binoculars, rusted security camera housings, and a tripod from a collapsed surveyor's kit. I didn't place it near the road. I tucked it into the shadow of the jasmine bush near my porch, its glass eyes aimed directly at the gap in the Pinecrest gates. If Jessica was talking about clearance, I wanted a record of it. On Friday night, the valley went unnaturally still. The usual hum of the crickets felt muted, as if even the insects were waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was sitting in my studio with the lights off, the only illumination coming from the dull green glass glow of the mirror wall. At 2:14 a.m., I saw it. A pair of headlights crested the hill, but they weren't the bright, aggressive LEDs of a modern SUV. They were dim, yellowed halogens. A beat-up white flatbed truck, the kind used by cut-rate landscaping crews, idled at the entrance to the gates. Then, a side gate, the small pedestrian entrance, clicked open. A figure stepped out. Even in the dark, I'd know that silhouette anywhere. The rigid spine, the purposeful, clicking stride. Jessica wasn't wearing her linen tunic tonight. She was in a dark windbreaker and leggings, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She walked over to the truck and began gesturing wildly toward my property. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her arms sweeping toward Norman's neck. She was pointing at his heavy steel torso, then back at the truck's winch. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't waiting for the court date. She was hiring independent contractors to perform a midnight aesthetic cleansing. I grabbed my phone and hit record on the wireless feed from the witness. The brass binoculars may have been decorative, but the 4K trail cam I'd hidden inside the surveyor's tripod was very, very real. "Just hook it," I heard a gravelly voice mutter from the truck. "You said the lady wouldn't be a problem." "She's a squatter in a junk pile," Jessica's voice hissed, carrying across the silent road. "She doesn't have the resources to fight a civil suit, let alone a police report. Just get the chain around the base. I want it gone before the morning commute." The man hopped out of the truck, dragging a heavy, rusted chain that clattered against the asphalt like Marley's ghost. He started toward my property line. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I wanted her to commit. I wanted her feet on my gravel. Jessica followed him, stepping over the blue tape boundary I'd marked weeks ago. She stood right at Norman's boots, looking up at him with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She reached out and kicked his steel toe, a sharp, metallic clang that echoed through the trees. "Ugly, useless thing," she spat. "Actually, he's a great listener," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the porch. Jessica jumped so hard she nearly tripped over the winch chain. She spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly until it hit my face. I didn't squint. I just stood there, my arms crossed, holding my phone up so she could see the glowing red wreck icon on the screen. "Willow," she gasped, her voice cracking. "I... we were just... this truck was lost. I was directing them back to the highway." "With a winch chain?" I asked, stepping down the porch stairs. "And a specific request to get it around the base?" "That's a very helpful bit of navigation, Jessica." The driver of the truck looked at me, then at Jessica, then at the camera hidden in the brass eyes of the witness. He didn't say a word. He just dropped the chain, climbed back into his cab, and reversed out of my driveway so fast he nearly took out the mailbox. Jessica stood alone on my gravel, the silence of the night rushing back in to swallow her. "You're trespassing, Jessica," I said quietly, "and I have you on camera attempting to hire a felonious destruction of private property. I imagine the board would be very interested to know what emergency gate maintenance funds we're going toward tonight." Her face went from pale to a mottled, bruised purple. The mask of prestige didn't just slip, it shattered. For a second, I thought she was going to lunge at me. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "You think you've won?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet fury. "You're a parasite, Willow. You're a rot on this community. I will spend every cent this HOA has to scrape you off this land." "You already are, Jessica," I said. "And that's exactly why you're going to lose." She turned and fled back toward the gates, the pedestrian door slamming behind her with a final, metallic shriek. I stood in the dark, watching the Tuscan sand gatehouse glow in the distance. My hands were shaking too now. I looked up at Norman. He looked back, his steel clipboard catching the moonlight. "One more week," I whispered to the gnome. "I think she's about to break." The week following the winch truck incident was a haunting, unnatural vacuum. No legal papers arrived. No city inspectors knocked. Even the silver Range Rover stayed behind the gates, tucked away in its three-car garage like a wounded animal. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that comes before a tornado. I couldn't work. I spent my days sitting on the porch, a mug of cold coffee in my lap, watching the gatehouse. I'd reinforced Norman's base with 4 additional bags of quick-set concrete, disguised under a layer of decorative river stones. I wasn't an artist anymore. I was a fortifier. Then came Tuesday, the hottest night of the year. The air was a wet wool blanket, and the moon was a sharp, taunting sliver. I was lying on the sofa in my studio, drifting into a restless sleep, when a sound sliced through the humid dark. Whir. Scream! It was a high-pitched, mechanical shriek, the sound of metal screaming against metal. I didn't even put on my boots. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my phone, sprinting toward the road in my bare feet. The gravel bit into my soles, but I didn't care. I rounded the corner of the jasmine hedge and stopped dead. The mirror wall was catching the strobe-like sparks of an industrial angle grinder. There, silhouetted against the rhythmic orange spray, was Jessica. She looked like a fever dream. She was wearing an ivory silk pajama set, the kind that costs more than my car, and a dark North Face vest. Her hair, usually a structural marvel of hairspray, was a wild, static-charged mane. She was halfway up a stepladder I recognized as my own, one she'd scavenged from the side of my shed. She wasn't just cleaning. She was performing an execution. The grinder was buried 3 inches into Norman's neck. The smell of burning steel and ozone filled the air, thick and acrid. Beside her on the grass sat a 5-gallon bucket of architectural beige exterior primer and a heavy-duty paint sprayer. "Jessica!" I shouted, the flashlight beam hitting her square in the face. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at me. She just leaned harder into the grinder, her eyes wide and glassy, fixed on the gash she was opening in Norman's throat. Sparks rained down on her silk sleeves, charring the expensive fabric, but she didn't seem to feel them. "I'm saving it," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the tool. "I'm saving the prestige. I'm fixing the error. You're a glitch, Willow. You're just a smudge on the glass." It took 3 hours and a lot of industrial solvent, but as the primer peeled away, it revealed the deep, jagged scar Jessica's grinder had left in his neck. I decided right then I wasn't going to weld it shut. That scar was part of his story now, a medal of honor for standing his ground. At noon, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. It wasn't Jessica's. 3 people stepped out. David, the donut neighbor, Linda, the treasurer, and a man I recognized as the HOA vice president, a high-strung actuary named Steve. They didn't march. They approached the porch steps like they were walking through a minefield. Steve was carrying a leather portfolio and looked like he hadn't slept since the grinder incident. "Willow?" Steve said, his voice cracking slightly. "May we?" "The porch is public adjacent," I said, leaning against the railing. Have a seat. I've got sun tea, but I'm fresh out of beige paint. Steve winced. He sat on the edge of a wicker chair, while Linda and David stood behind him like bodyguards. We've had an emergency board meeting, Steve began, opening his portfolio. Jessica has been removed. Effectively, immediately. The board has also voted to drop all pending litigation against you. We've instructed our law firm to cease all discovery requests. That's a good start, Steve, I said. But your emergency gate maintenance fund is missing about $20,000. And my lawyer, well, Marcus, says I have a very strong case for harassment under color of authority, trespass, and felony criminal mischief. Linda spoke up then, her voice firm. The board knows. We've reviewed the ledgers Jessica was hiding. She wasn't just acting as a neighbor, she was signing those legal retainers as the president of this HOA. If you sue the organization, our insurance won't cover it because she exceeded her authority. Every homeowner in Pinecrest would be hit with a special assessment to pay your settlement. Our property values would actually tank, which is exactly what Jessica was afraid of, I noted. The irony is delicious. Steve cleared his throat. We're here to offer a settlement. We want to avoid a public trial that would drag this on for years. We're offering a community arts grant. It's essentially a cash settlement for the damages to your property and the emotional distress. How much? I asked. 50,000, Steve said. And we'll pay for the construction of a new, soundproofed studio on your property. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the HOA's internal finances, and you agree not to sue the organization as a whole. You're free to pursue Jessica personally for the criminal acts. I looked at Norman. He looked back, his scarred neck glinting in the sun. I looked at Linda and David, who were both nodding at me. This wasn't just about money. It was about a treaty. I'll sign, I said, on 3 conditions. Steve leaned forward, pen ready. Name them. 1. I want a permanent, legally binding aesthetic easement attached to my deed. This property is exempt from any future municipal or HOA-led aesthetic complaints. Forever. Done, Steve said. 2. Jessica is banned from the board for life, and the HOA must install a plaque at the gatehouse, right where the mirror wall hits it, that says, "This community honors individual expression." Steve hesitated, then nodded. A bit pointed, but done. And 3, I said, a grin finally breaking through the exhaustion. The HOA has to commission a piece. I want a Norman Jr. installed right inside the gates. A reminder for everyone driving in that the prestige stops where the art begins. David let out a bark of laughter. Steve looked at the iron gates, then back at me. He sighed, the weight of the last few months finally slumping his shoulders. Consider it commissioned, Willow. Just make sure he's not holding a grinder. The air in the valley finally cleared. The heavy, pressurized humidity of the Jessica era broke with a massive thunderstorm 2 days after the porch summit, washing the last of the copper dust and sanded steel into the thirsty California soil. When the sun came out the next morning, it didn't feel like a spotlight. It just felt like Tuesday. The settlement cleared faster than I expected. It turns out an HOA board moved by the collective fear of a massive lawsuit is the most efficient engine in the American legal system. The construction crew arrived a week later. They weren't the cut-rate midnight contractors Jessica had tried to hire. These were pros. They poured the slab for my new studio, 30 by 40 feet of reinforced concrete with floor-to-ceiling industrial windows and a ventilation system that could handle a dragon's breath. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to weld in a drafty wooden shed with a fire extinguisher tucked under my arm. But the real victory wasn't the studio. It was the gatehouse. I spent a month on the commission for Norman Jr. I didn't make him 10 feet tall. I made him life-sized, roughly 4 feet of polished, high-grade stainless steel. He didn't have a scowl. I gave him a serene, almost Buddha-like smile. And instead of a clipboard, he was holding a small, metallic bird in his open palm. On the day of the unveiling, the underground resistance turned into a full-blown block party. Steve, the new acting president, stood by the wrought iron gates with a pair of oversized scissors. Half the neighborhood was there. People I'd only seen through tinted windshields were now standing on my gravel driveway, drinking lemonade and taking selfies with the original Norman. To a new era of, well, let's call it cohesive variety, Steve announced, snipping the ribbon. The crowd cheered. As the gates hummed open, there he was. Norman Jr., bolted into a pedestal of Tuscan sandstone right next to the keypad. He looked magnificent. He looked permanent. I looked across the street at Jessica's house. The for sale sign had gone up 3 days after she'd posted bail. The grass was already starting to grow past the 3-inch limit, and the white columns looked dull, without my mirror wall's green glow to haunt them. I heard she'd moved 2 towns over to a condo complex where the rules were even stricter. Somewhere she could be the victim of someone else's prestige. I walked back to my porch and sat in Grand's old wicker chair. The mirror wall was still there, but I'd adjusted the panels one last time. Now, instead of reflecting light at the neighbors, they were angled to catch the sunrise and throw a soft, golden warmth directly onto my new studio door. Linda walked over, a mini Norman tucked under her arm. "He looks good, Willow. The scar on his neck. It catches the light." "It's his best feature," I said. "Reminds everyone that you can try to cut him down, but the steel goes all the way through." I looked up at the original Norman. He stood at the edge of the property, a 10-foot titan of scrap and soul, his rebar beard glinting in the afternoon sun. He wasn't just a garden ornament anymore. He was the gatekeeper. I picked up my sketchbook and flipped to a fresh page. The studio was finished, the war was over, and I had $50,000 in the bank. I had a lot of ideas for what came next. Maybe a dragon for the roof? Or a fleet of metallic butterflies to line the entrance corridor. I smiled, the smell of jasmine and ozone filling my lungs. For the first time in years, the view from my porch was exactly how I wanted it. The for sale sign on Jessica's old property didn't stay up for long. For 3 weeks, the real estate agents paced the Tuscan sand driveway with anxious expressions, likely terrified that Norman's scarred, 10-foot silhouette would scare off any serious buyers. Then, the moving truck arrived. It wasn't a sleek, corporate van. It was a battered, psychedelic painted hauler that looked like it had been retired from a touring circus. I was out on my porch, polishing the chrome scales of my new Dragon in Progress, when the new owner stepped out. He wasn't wearing a linen tunic or carrying a clipboard. He was a man in his 60s with a beard that rivaled Norman's for sheer volume, wearing a tie-dyed Hawaiian shirt and a pair of mismatched Crocs. He stood at the edge of the street, staring at Norman for a long, silent minute. I held my breath, waiting for the first complaint, the first mention of property values, or the first call to the city. Instead, he threw his head back and laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the HOA's iron gates. He walked straight across the road, ignoring the stop sign and the painted boundary lines. "Magnificent," he rumbled, pointing at the gnome's welded rebar beard. "Is that a 1950s tractor axle I see in the skeletal structure?" "Good eye," I said, stepping down the stairs. "I'm Willow." "Arthur?" he said, shaking my hand with a grip like a vice. "I just moved into the mausoleum of beige across the way. I spent 40 years as a kinetic engineer for theme parks. I've been looking for a place where I could finally build my sonic wind chime project without some bureaucrat measuring my grass with a ruler." I looked over his shoulder at Jessica's old house. 2 movers were currently struggling to carry a massive copper-coiled Tesla coil through the front door. "A sonic wind chime?" I asked, a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face. "It uses the natural valley draft to create a low-frequency hum that supposedly vibrates the soul," Arthur explained. "Though I suspect the HOA might find it a bit resonant." "Arthur?" I said, gesturing toward my new high-tech welding studio. "I think we're going to be very good friends. And if you ever need to borrow an angle grinder or some high-intensity floodlights, you know where to find me." As we stood there, the gates of Pinecrest Estates hummed open to let a black SUV through. The driver, a younger man who looked like he'd just been promoted to the beautification committee, slowed down, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the rebel artist and the new resident of '01 Oakmont shaking hands in front of a giant, scarred gnome. He didn't stop. He didn't even roll down his window. He just accelerated into the community, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. The war was over, but the era of cohesive variety was just beginning. I looked at Arthur, then at Norman, and finally at the open doors of my studio. The entrance corridor was about to get a whole lot louder. And that's Willow's story. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate you dropping a like and maybe throw in a comment to let me know what other HOA stories you'd like to hear. Hope that you have a great rest of your day. and I'll catch you all next time.